Everyone. Hey, I want to welcome everybody here today, especially if you're visiting with us. We want to welcome you and those that are watching on Facebook today. We're just thankful that you're able to have that capability of being with us today. I'm going to fill in this week and next week for Dave and his family while they're on a well-deserved vacation. And my lesson today is going to be what I call a threefold lesson and a two-part lesson, which means 2/3 of it is going to be preached today, 1/3 of it next week. Now, when I thought about titling this lesson, I titled it The Journey, the Church, and the Book. But if I were to subtitle it, I would title it Things That You Don't Know, Things That You May Not Know if you're under 45, and Things That You Did Know but may have forgotten. So it kind of comes out like this. Today we're going to look at our spiritual journeys, your spiritual journey, my spiritual journey. And there's some things that I believe that you probably don't know about your spiritual journey, but you may. I'm going to share a little bit about my spiritual journey and how I ended up at the Church of Christ, and some things you definitely don't know about my journey. And finally, we're going to look at some things about the church today. In case you're new with the Church of Christ, there's a little bit of history behind the Church of Christ. So we're going to look at how the Church of Christ ended up coming to the United States. So a little bit of church history here. And finally, next week, we're going to look at this amazing book called the Bible and some things that you might have known but may have forgotten. So let's get started. A spiritual journey is a God-directed path that we are on in life that leads us to the exact place right here today. Now, I believe that each and every one of us were on a spiritual journey at some point. The question is when did that spiritual journey actually begin? And I think for most of us, you probably thought that like I used to think, our spiritual journey began when we were baptized into Christ. Makes sense, right? New birth. We had an old birth. We have a new birth. We have new beginnings. And we always think that that's where our spiritual journey started. But what if I were to tell you that your spiritual journey may very well have started with your first birth? Or even better yet, what if I told you that your spiritual journey may have started at conception in your mother's womb? Sounds a little crazy, doesn't it? Well, you know what? The psalmist David, he didn't think so. We all know that David, in spite of his sins, his shortcomings, and his failures in life, he continued to have a personal relationship with God that was just amazing. I mean, even to the point where God called him a man after his own heart. David seemed to have some insights into God's true connection with us that maybe we don't have today. In Psalms 139, David's going to pen some words that indicate that God's plan for him actually began with his conception. The crazy thing is, David's even going to speak of some things that he couldn't have possibly have known on his own, but that his involvement with God played out in real life, second by second. So let's take a look. We're going to start in Psalms 139, verses 1 through 4. He says, Lord, you have searched me and you have known me. You know when I sit down, you know when I get up. You understand my thoughts from far away. I mean, have you ever felt like maybe God isn't there in your life, or maybe that he's far away somewhere? But listen to what David says. Notice how closely he's connected with us on a daily basis. He searches us. He understands us. And even in some of the very mundane things of life, when you're sitting down, you know, when I'm in my recliner in my living room, when I get up to go to the refrigerator maybe to get a snack or something, he's there. He's constantly there with us. Look at verse 3. You scrutinize my path and my lying down. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think about the word scrutinize, I don't like it, right? I mean, you get this feeling that somebody's looking at you under a microscope or through a magnifying glass, and they're looking for your faults and the things that are wrong with you. So I had to look up this Hebrew word for scrutinize because this didn't make any sense to me. And what I found was really interesting. The word scrutinize here was a word that they used in the threshing floor, and it meant to winnow. or to scatter. So when they brought the wheat into the threshing floor, they would separate the wheat from the chaff. And it was a process that was called scrutinizing. So think about this. God scrutinizes our paths on a daily basis. He's always refining us. He's always making us a better version of what we were the day before. He goes on to say, and you are acquainted with all my ways. Even before there's a word on my tongue, God already knows what we're thinking, what we're going to say. Not only was God continually present in David's life, but he was present and actively involved at his conception. Let's jump down to verse 13 now. David kind of goes backwards from present day to the time he was in his mother's womb. And he says this, God, you created my innermost parts, and you wove me together in my mother's womb. You know, I think about that. What poetic language, first of all, he uses here. Some say he knitted us together. He weaves us together. Like the master weaver, God was there at conception, weaving David's inner parts. Think about that. His heart, his kidneys, his lungs, his capillaries, his miles and miles of veins that was in with his body, God is knitting them all together. He says, I'll give thanks to you because I'm awesomely and wonderfully made, and wonderful are your works. Next, David goes, he moves from there to his inward parts, to his skeletal frame. And he says, my frame even wasn't hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully formed in the depths of the earth. Now check this out. David's about to say something that he has no idea really what he's saying. He says, your eyes have seen my unformed substance. Did you know it wasn't until 1870 that medical science actually figured out how a baby was made and formed within the mother's womb in the growing process? Did you know it wasn't until 1950 when we first invented the ultrasound that for the first time man's eyes saw an embryo? And you know what they saw? That it was an unformed substance. How'd David know this? 3,000 years before we discovered this in medical science, David knew that he was an unformed substance. He goes on to say, and make sure I didn't get my lesson turned around here. He goes on to say, and in your book were written all the days that were ordained for me, when there was not one of them yet written or taken place. Again, think about that. Before David's life ever began, his story was already written. Not that God wrote it in such a way that David couldn't make his own choices, because we know he did, and he made some bad choices, right? But the story was already written in the sense that God could see from the beginning, from conception to the end of David's life, everything that would transpire from his triumphs to his failures. I mean, make no mistake about it, no matter how insignificant you think your life is, and I think my life is, God is always there. He's watching, He's knowing, He's hearing, He's understanding everything about you. From the time your eyes open up in the morning to the time you go to bed at night. Well, see, I think like David, all of us are on a spiritual journey, and I do believe that there's some things that we might not know about our spiritual journey, and I encourage you. I kind of trace mine back, and I want you to think about doing that. Get a journal and trace your journey all the way back as far as your early remembrances in life, and think about all the times, the twists, the turns, the people that God put in your life that sent you on a path in a direction that you ended up right here today. I'm going to share a few things with you today about my spiritual journey. It's things that I'm pretty sure that you don't know. So my spiritual journey, at least from an earthly standpoint, started on May 7th, 1954. I was the youngest of 4 children. Now, some of you may have met my brother and sister, Gary and Judy. But something that you don't know was that I had an older sister. In fact, she was the firstborn that died shortly after birth. Her name was Linda. Never met Linda. But I'm hoping that someday, when I get to heaven, that I'm actually going to meet my older sister, Linda, and find out a little bit about her. My entire childhood was spent growing up in Norton, Ohio. The earliest recollections I have are in 1959. I was 5 years old. We lived in Sherman, Ohio, in this little rented shack on the south side of the track. I don't know if that's the good side or the bad side of the tracks that I grew up in, but on the south side of the tracks, in this little rented shack. Yeah, there's me in our outside pool. Obviously, it's a wash tub. Not only did we not have an outside pool, we didn't have inside facilities, if you know what I mean. Anybody grow up with an outhouse? A couple people back there. We had an outhouse out back. And my sister told me a story recently that I hadn't heard before. But not only, I remember the outhouse, but what I didn't remember was, she said, inside our house, we had what was called a slop pot. Now, I don't even like the sound of that, okay, a slop pot. But it was evidently some kind of a bucket or a can that we would go to the bathroom in. And, you know, it came in real handy in the middle of the night, right? Who wants to wander out in the dark to the outhouse, or in the wintertime, huh? When you were sick. But she told me that there was 5 of us. So she told me every morning Dad would get up and he would go in and he would take the slop pot out and he would dump it into the outhouse. I have a greater respect for my father today after hearing that story than what I ever had. Well, hey, were we poor? I don't know. I guess you could say we weren't rich. But you know what? No one ever told me that we weren't rich. I didn't know. I was a happy kid, you know, obviously. By the way, I have another picture with that potato chip bucket on my head. Didn't bring that today. Well, anyways, in 1960, the very following year, there's a new development opening up in Norton, Ohio. Actually, it was a Clinton mailing address, but it was Norton school system. Some of you might know it was called Melody Village, where all the streets had musical names. Now, I lived at 5715 Overture Way. I still remember that. But it was a new development that came up. And fortunately, we did have inside facilities there, so it was nice. It was a newer home, 3-bedroom ranch, that sort of thing. But my religious background, that's what I really want to get to. You know, I didn't grow up in the church. And as far as my religious background was concerned, I can remember some things. I think before I was born, my parents went to First Baptist Church here in Barberton. So I do have kind of, you know, there's kind of that Baptist background throughout here. But later I can remember, as I got a little bit older, there was what was called Covenant Baptist Church. Does it still exist? I don't even know. It was over on the south side southwest side of Barberton. And there was another church, but I kind of remember going to Vacation Bible School. It was Norton Baptist Church. I might went one time there. But across the street from us on Tempo Trail, see the musical connection there? On Tempo Trail, there was a family, and I think their name might have been the Morrisons. But anyways, on Tuesday nights, they would have a Bible study for kids in the neighborhood. And I can remember going to that a few times. But other than that, that was about the extent of my religious upbringing. But one thing that I knew for sure, at a very young age, I knew that there was a God, I knew that there was a heaven, and I knew that there was a hell, and I knew I didn't want to go to hell. Now, what's strange is why this memory comes back to me. When I'm very young, I can remember praying to God when I'd go to bed at night. I had this fear of dying, and I would say, please let me live until I'm 99 years old. Now, I know what you're all thinking out there. Why 99? Why didn't you go for the 100? I don't know why. I really don't. But for some reason, maybe I thought that was pushing the envelope a little too much, you know, with God, asking Him for that final year. But here's what I want to tell you today that I found out. I stand before you today. I'm 69 years old. So do I have another 30 years to go? I have no idea. But I will tell you this, and I think if you can confirm this with some of the older people here in the audience, that it seems like the older that I get, the less desire I have about the things of this earth. And I got a feeling that by the time you get into your 80s and your 90s, you're done. You're thinking, I don't need this old earth anymore. I just want to go home. And so if I don't make it to 99, guys, hey, I just wanted you to know I'm good with that. Part of my participation in my religious journey started around the year 1970. Now, I'm a sophomore in high school at the time. The Vietnam War is going on. A lot of political unrest going on in our country. At that time, many of the young people were protesting against the war and against the establishment. In fact, 3 days before my 16th birthday, in May of 1970, May 4th of 1970, 3 days before my birthday, Kent State University took place, where 4 young people lost their lives during the protests against the war. It was also a time of the hippie movement. Now, I am actually bringing the hippies up for a particular reason. First of all, everybody that lived in the 60s and 70s thought they were hippies. They weren't, trust me, okay? But the hippie movement came onto the scene about that time, and what the hippies were all about, they were about peace, and they were about love, and they were about not bathing and wearing weird clothing, okay? So I definitely wasn't a hippie. Now, any given day, I had my bell-bottom jeans and my extra wide white belt, right, the leather belt, the paisley shirt, and my peace sign medallion hanging around my neck. So that was about the extent of me being a hippie. But what's going to happen during this time is a spiritual revolution is just about to take place. It's funny because when man begins to wander away from God by the masses, God tends to bring around revivals into people's lives. And this was one of the times that this happened. By the late 60s and early 70s, 2 of the biggest bands at the time, the Beatles and the Beach Boys, started wandering away from those Christian roots that they may have grown up with, and they started going into Hinduism and the Far East teachings. In fact, they were following a guy called the Maharishi Yogi. He was the one that invented transcendental meditation. But because they were such big bands, many of the masses in the United States, of the young people, started falling away and following into this Far East religions. Well, I remember at the time, there were people running around that called themselves Jesus freaks. Anybody remember the Jesus freaks? Well, if you think that God wasn't aware of what was going on, this revival begins to take place. Now, they were ones that got tired of the drug scene, and they got tired of the free love scene, and they started following Jesus by the masses. In fact, there's a movie out. I haven't seen it yet. Have somebody seen it? Okay, with Kelsey Grammer in it, and it depicts that time in history. I would like to see the movie. But you know, it really made sense. It was called the Jesus Revolution. But it really made sense to me that the hippie movement would somewhere gravitate towards Jesus. Because if you think about it, the pictures that are depicted of Jesus during that time are what? Long hair, long beard, right? Long robes and Roman sandals. That's exactly how the hippies dressed. So it made a lot of sense looking back that they would begin to follow. Now, this is where my religious thoughts began to form. Now, for some reason, I had this crazy idea that if you were a preacher, you had a free ticket to heaven. Because if anybody was going to be up on God's list, it would be a preacher, right? Now, looking at the preachers today, I'm not so sure. But back then, that's how I thought. So somewhere in my mind, in high school, I thought, maybe I should become a preacher. Had no idea where I was going to be led, into this thing. But maybe I should become a preacher. Now, the problem was I didn't have any religious background. I don't even think I owned a Bible at the time. So I did what any logical teenager would do that wanted to be a preacher. I stole one. So there's my confession for the day, guys. let's just say I took it out of the Norton Library without checking it out, and I never returned it. I don't even know where that Bible is today, by the way. But I'm already breaking the 8th commandment, and I don't even know there is an 8th commandment. So I began to tell some of my friends that someday I wanted to be a preacher. I started to read the Bible, and I had no clue what I was reading for the most part, but a lot of it was Jesus' words, and Jesus' words made sense for me. In 1972 then, I'm 18 years old, I just graduated from high school. Now at the time, they were drafting young men into, there was still like 3 years left in the Vietnam War, and they began to draft young men into the war. Now, they had what was called the lottery. Believe me, this isn't a lottery you want to win. But they attached a number to your birth month. For some reason, I think mine was 572, and don't ask me why. I don't have any proof of that. But I remember watching the news, because I think on the news was where they would show you what your number was going to be, and if your number came up, then you were going off to war. Now, I already had a fear of dying, and I really didn't have a liking to killing somebody else, so I was in trouble. But I thought, okay, well, if I have to go, I'll go. My number never came up. So I didn't have to go, and I was thankful for that. But now I had to decide, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? Like most of my friends, I'm still not going to church yet at this time, and I had no idea what God had in store for me. But after graduation, I started dating a girl that was a member of the Church of Christ. And she requested that I start coming to church with her. Now, I really think it was probably her parents that requested that I started coming to church with her. But either way, that was fine. But let me tell you about then, things that I see that are different. These people, they went to Sunday morning Bible study. They went to Sunday morning service. There was a Sunday evening service where the preacher had to prepare a second lesson. And on top of that, the churches of Christ back at that time, they had what was called gospel meetings. I mean, these things were like week-long, and you were expected to be there every night. And not only was our church having gospel meetings, but other churches of Christ in the area were having gospel meetings, and anybody, they would be there at those meetings. I thought, man, these are the most religious people I ever met in my entire life. But a change of action is starting to take place in my life. I was about to get a biblical education of a lifetime. Now, this brings us into about the history of the Church of Christ. Because I knew nothing about the church, just having the little Baptist background that I had. But as I listened to the preaching, I started to hear something a little bit different that was intermingled in with just the lessons about Christian living. These people seemed overly concerned about the fact that the church that Jesus started in the first century, all of a sudden, over hundreds of years, have divided off now into all these different denominations. I'm thinking to myself, well, why are there all these different denominations out there? In fact, 1972, there was 350 different denominations that wore the name Christian. Well, it just seemed like what happened at the time was, over all those years, every time the church seemed to get a little bit off track about what the Bible actually taught, somebody would rise up. A man or a group would rise up, and they would try to reform the church. And when that didn't happen, then eventually they would just start a church of their own. Well, over hundreds of years, the next thing you know, we have 350 different churches. But it was just something different that I noticed about the Church of Christ. They wanted to try to unify everybody, thinking that on the basis of the Bible, we could all become united in Christ. Well, we see how that worked out, right? But thought we could become united in the church. But it was a time that was called the Reformation period, when they were trying to reform the church, until one day, there was a father and son. They were two Irishmen. They attended the Presbyterian Church. Their name was Thomas and Alexander Campbell. And upon praying about this, they came to the conclusion, both at the same time, that the church could be united based on the Bible alone. they came to about 1807, I think it was, that they came over here. Thomas came first and Alexander came later. And they started to present this idea of let's restore the church. And it became known as the Restoration Movement. Now, some of the things that they taught was, and I like these ideas, it was really good for me to hear this, we need to have book, chapter, and verse for everything that we practice, whether it be within the church or outside of the church. Made sense to me. At one time, the Church of Christ was the fastest growing church in America. They had sayings like, if it was a matter of faith, there should be unity. If it were matters of opinion, there should be liberty. But in all things, there should be charity or love. I think that's I don't know if that's on our bulletin or not, but somewhere I've seen that since I've been here. They would say, let us speak where the Bible speaks, but be silent where the Bible is silent. We're not the only Christians out there, but we are Christians only. I know I've seen that here before too. We are Christians only. In other words, they wore no other name but the Christian name. Their mantra was, 1 Peter 3:15, be ready to give an answer to everyone that asks of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. In the years ahead, there would be dozen other men, there's lots of them, Raccoon John Smith and different people, that picked up the torch and just carried this idea that all churches could become unified under the Bible. Well, this made sense to me. I like the idea. I agree with the idea that, there should be unity amongst the churches. Eventually, I came to a place to where I started hearing lessons about baptism, and eventually I was baptized into Christ for the remission of my sins. And I thought, heaven knows I had enough of them. But in fact, sometimes I think maybe they should have held me under just a little bit longer, But I began to study the Bible at that point, and I'll tell you something. All of a sudden, I had this desire to learn from this book called the Bible. What an amazing book. I began to study night and day. I would carry this thing to work with me, and during my lunch break, I'd be studying, and I'd have my highlighter, and I'd be highlighting passages of Scripture, and I'd be underlining things, and I'd be writing notes in the sidelines when the preacher was preaching. For the next 10 years, I immersed myself in the Word. And I'll tell you what, it was amazing to me that I was holding in my hand the actual Word of the God of the universe. It's an amazing book. For the next 50 years, or 50 years later, as I look at the Bible, there's still many amazing things that I find that it doesn't seem to really change. I see things new every single day. But think about this. We have the Word of God in our hands. And that's where the lesson ends today. Next week, we're going to look at this amazing Word of God and some things that you may have once known, but I think sometimes we tend to forget about. Today, if you're not a Christian, I don't know where you're at in your spiritual journey, but I'm sure that God is leading you down a path. If you're here today, He's leading you in a direction. If you haven't become a Christian, if you haven't been baptized for the remission of your sins, I encourage you to come down and do that today. Or maybe you've been a member for a long, long, long time, and sometimes you feel like God's far away and you just need prayer. If you come forward as we stand and sing, we will take care of that for you. Let's stand together.